Hi, my name is Raymond Plata. I'm a spokesperson for Revolution Books. I also am part of the Bob Avakian Institute, and I write for RevCom.us and Revolution Newspaper, and I am a political economist. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's special program. The program features George Mallinckrodt, who is the author of Getting Away with Murder, and I will introduce him formally, and the person who will be in conversation with him, Carl Dix. But before we start, I want to do a little house cleaning, as we call it. Let people know that the bathrooms are over here in the back, so you can make your way. There's a little aisle here, you can make your way back there. And I want to ask that everyone turn off their cell phone right now, or your cell phones if you have more than one. And we ask people to do that for two reasons. One, we don't want to have the flow and the spontaneity and the thoughtfulness of programs like this disrupted by cell phones going off. And two, because, hello, this is Revolution Books. Hello, this is a world dominated, by empire, by the U.S. capitalist imperialists who have historically stopped at nothing to hold on to their rule, and whose agencies, like the National Security Agency and the FBI, are listening in as much as they can, gathering data and intelligence, because they want to know what you think and how you want to act, and they want to act preemptively against this because they want to hold on to power. And we have to take this very seriously. I just do have to say that I was listening once to Glenn Greenwald, who has exposed a lot of the intrusiveness of the National Security Agency, and he said that sometimes people say, well, I have nothing to hide. He said, if you have nothing to hide, two things. One, you don't understand what they want to know about you and how serious they are about preserving their rule. And two, if you have nothing to hide, you're a very boring person. So turn your cell phones off, everyone. Okay? Now, Revolution Books, some of you have been here before, some of you are newcomers, and to all I welcome you. This is the bookstore where people come from across the street and from around the world to find the books and the engagement about why the world is the way it is and how it can be radically transformed. Today somebody comes in from Harlem, a local author, wants to share his book with us. And then there were 3 people that came in from France that wanted to know, what? A revolution in the United States? Revolutionary communism in the United States? Yes. At this bookstore, you discover that. This is where people come, as I said, to find out why the world is the way it is and how it can be transformed through revolution. And you look around at the books. You look at the richness of what's here, the literature, the science, the history, the philosophy. This is all part of what makes this bookstore so essential, because this embodies the insights of so many different strands of thought and the creative insight of so many different authors and trends of understanding. And this here is what happens at this bookstore. You discover the world. You discover insights. You discover the works of imagination, of novelists, of poets, the aspirations of people throughout the world. This is a bookstore about the world. Look at our world literature section. It's really quite extraordinary. And you also discover the most advanced scientific approach to understanding human society and making a revolution that can truly emancipate humanity. And that is the work, the leadership, and the vision of Bob Avakian and the new synthesis that he has brought forward. And that's the robust mix, the excitement of this store, that this new synthesis of communism And you can go to the section, The Emancipation of Humanity, and look at the books. Basics. Look at the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America. Look at Observations on Art, Culture, Science, and Philosophy by Abathian. And that is interacting with all this other work here. And we're processing it and mining it and learning all that we can as part of understanding the world more deeply in order to make the revolution that humanity demands if people are to truly flourish as human beings in this world. So this is where you come to find out why the world is the way it is and how it can be changed. It is where you encounter this most scientific approach that also is infused with a poetic spirit. That's what happens here at Revolution Books. And I want to welcome you all to tonight's program. And I'm going to say some more about our fundraising drive and how all of you can become part of and contribute to it. Because this bookstore not only has to survive, it has to thrive, because this bookstore is needed more than ever. So tonight's program, we're going to hear from George Mallinckrodt. George is a licensed psychotherapist who has been in public and private practice for over 20 years. And he also, and I just learned this 2 days ago, he's also an artist. So he is someone that we want to hear from and learn more about. And Carl Dix is a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and he is the co-initiator with Cornel West of the Stop Mass Incarceration Network. So what our plan for tonight is to have George give a presentation. He might read from the book about getting away with murder, and I'm going to leave it to George to describe what this is about. And then we'll have little comments from me about our fundraising drive, because I want to draw everyone into this so they know what the stakes are and how they can be part of it. So I want to talk about our fund drive after his presentation. And then there's going to be a discussion between George and Carl Dix, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And I do want to give people 2 program notes that I will come back to later. But mark this on your calendars. 1, Friday this week, the Revolution Club will be having its open mic night. So I want to invite all of you, creative minds, writers, souls, to come out. And on August 19th, and this is really phenomenal, the New York Times, the author, Ya Gyasi, wrote a book, a new novel, her debut novel, Homegoing. That novel was featured on the front page of the New York Times book review. Wow. She is a Ghanaian-born writer. This is an extraordinary work. It has garnered amazing praise. She is coming to Revolution Books on August 19th, 7 p.m. Yes, here! And I want everyone to know that now, because they just agreed to this program. They're very excited to be doing it here. And we're going to have a great time. So that's what this bookstore is about. It's about revolution. It's about Ya Gyasi coming and reading from her book. It's about what is now to begin. George Mallinckrodt telling us about the horrors of the Florida state prisons. So let's take it from there.
It's a privilege for me to be here tonight at Revolution Books. I learned about this place through a friend of mine, Kat Waters, and I'm honored. This is a very important resource for this community, and in service of the idea of keeping this place going and thriving, everybody who buys my book tonight, the profit will go to Revolution Books. And if you want to add a little extra, they're not going to keep you from doing that. Okay? So I was just reflecting on my journey, and this has been quite a journey. And it was around this time 4 years ago that I started to write this book. And there is no way, with even my outrageous imagination, that I could picture myself being before you tonight in Harlem. It's just been stunning what's happened to me, how this issue has been propelled forward, and what I'm trying to do to get the word out. And part of it is coming and speaking to people like you. I spent nearly 3 years working in a Florida State Prison psychiatric ward, counseling patients with severe mental health issues. I had people on my caseload that were paranoid schizophrenic. I had paranoid personality disorder. I had delusional personality disorder. You name it, I pretty much had it. I worked with cutters. I worked with cutters who literally didn't care if they lived or they died. And when they cut themselves, there were often secondary benefits. First of all, they would get high, which I didn't quite understand at first till they explained it to me. And in fact, one cutter said, the time right before I pass out is the best. I get higher than any drug I've ever been on. So if they don't die, they wake up usually in a hospital. And a hospital stay compared to prison is a vacation. They get better food, they get television, and as one man said it, he woke up and a nurse was giving him a sponge bath, and he got a Woody. And I was thinking, okay, whatever works for you. So these were some of the people that I worked with, and initially in my work, I was seeing abuse of our patients at the hands of correctional officers, but I wasn't labeling it as such. For example, about 4 months in, I was called to the cell of one of my patients, a severely mentally ill man. In fact, I would take him out in a session and he would just sit across from me and stare at me. He just didn't respond. And what he was doing was he was flinging his food tray, a big, heavy brown tray, at the window, the unbreakable window of his cell door, over and over like a frisbee. I went up to the door, and had that glass not been there, he could have taken my head off. I mean, he was flinging it as hard as he could. What I found odd at the time was that there was no food on the cell door window. I didn't know what to make of it. I looked in, there was no food in his cell. And I wrote it off. I said, okay, this is a man having a psychotic episode, and you know, that's understandable. In retrospect, what the guards had done was they gave this man an empty tray. They didn't feed him. I didn't know. I was green behind the ears. And one of the issues I have with these private prison companies is that they minimize their efforts in bringing to light abuse in prison. And in our employee manual, the only mention of inmate abuse was one sentence: employees shall not abuse inmates in any manner. No guidance in how to recognize the more subtle forms of abuse, like an empty tray with no food. No guidance in reporting abuse if we heard about it or saw it. So this is what I like to call strategic non-intervention on the part of these private prison companies. In other words, if the ship is sailing in the direction they want it to go, they're not going to step in and redirect it. And all of these private prison companies, whether they run the prisons or, like my company, Horizon Health, provides medical and mental health staff, they don't want to address the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the culture of brutality that not only exists in the Florida Department of Corrections, but exists in every prison and jail in the United States of America.
Yes.
And the issue I have here is that there's this attitude that to control the population, you have to do it through violence.
Yes.
And I found the opposite was true. I treated my men with respect. Every single patient I had, I treated them as a human being. And they treated me back with respect. I never had any problems with any of the men on my caseload. So this is one of my pet peeves, and the new, well, she's not new anymore, Secretary Julie Jones of the Florida Department of Corrections never mentions the culture of brutality in anything she's ever said. And so what we're seeing in Florida is we're seeing prison riots. And I predicted this a year ago. And they're not rioting because the food is lousy. And trust me, it's really bad. They feed these guys hydrolyzed, textured soy protein. Sounds good, huh? They put this in their tray, covered up with gravy, and then give it some name like I don't know, barbecued beef. It's horrible stuff. And they feed them about 10 meals out of the week with this crap. They're not rioting because the food's bad. They're not rioting because there's no air conditioning throughout every single Florida prison, except in some of the units like the one I worked in, which was spotty at best. It was broken half the time. They're not rioting for those reasons. They're rioting because they're treated like crap. They're treated disrespectfully. And when you treat somebody with disrespect, it's like kicking a dog over and over again and expecting it not to bite you.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a huge issue I have when I talk about prison reform, and it really ties into recidivism, because a culture of brutality ends up having people leave prison worse off than when they went in. And we're wondering why recidivism rates are high. So that sort of got my journey going in my work in that prison psychiatric unit. And it was a little over 2 years into this thing, and one of my patients was taken by guards, cuffed behind his back, taken to a hallway where there were no cameras. He was thrown to the floor, and 4 or 5 guards just started kicking the crap out of him. I mean, really going after him big time. And if it wasn't for the intervention of my coworker Carmen, who's a principal figure in my book, she came from another area and came upon the door to the hallway, and all the doors had very large panes of unbreakable glass. She looked through to see this man just being brutalized, and she banged on the door, "Stop, stop, stop." And they finally stopped, they gathered him off, and then they hauled him back to his cell. Carmen was so in fear of retaliation from these guards that on the incident report, she wrote down that she didn't see anything. The head of the psychiatric unit, I call her Dr. Robles in the book, signed off on that report. Now, that is against DOC policy. There is a rule, of course, DOC rules are often not followed, but for me, that wasn't working at all, because I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy that's going to go along with that program, sit on the sidelines, and allow my patients to continue to be abused. So, in a morning meeting, after this guy pulled up his shirt in an anger management group, and he had bruises all over his torso, even his back, I raised the issue. I said, guards beat one of our patients. What are we going to do about it? Dead silence. I said, when guards do this to our patients, They sabotage our work as mental health professionals. Dead silence. Every single thing that I brought up was met with silence. And finally, the head of the psychiatric unit looked over at me and said, "Well, Mr. Mallinckrodt, if you're having concerns, you should put it in writing." I thought about strangling her right then. I was going to jump across the conference table. This is what I faced, okay? Consequently, after that, I had a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with Warden Cummings. That's his real name. I told him about the abuse of our patients in the unit, and he seemed receptive. He seemed authentic, and he asked me to do incident reports as I heard of abuse. So I started turning these things out, and apparently that didn't sit well with a number of people, and 2 months after the beating, I was fired. And you know, at the time, I didn't know what to make of it, but then, of course, I found out that this is the way the Department of Corrections works. If you make too much noise, they get rid of you one way or the other.
Yep.
So then, 10 months after that, I answer the phone, hello, and typically you don't expect to hear, "They killed him!" And it was my coworker, Carmen, the one who witnessed the beating of another patient, who called me to tell me about Darren Rainey, the man on the cover of my book. The guards took Darren Rainey, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and put him into a specially rigged shower where he had no control over the water temperature. They blasted him with water in excess of 180 degrees. And this is absolutely for real, because when I tried to wash my hands under hot water, I mean, literally, you couldn't put your hand under there for a split second without feeling the pain. And while he was maybe not hit with direct spray, you can imagine in a small closet-like room, the air temperature rising to unbearable levels, and he begged to be let out. He kept saying, "Stop, stop, let me out. I won't do it no more, I won't do it no more." And what he had done was he smeared feces around his cell. And we saw that all the time. These men, some of them were severely mentally ill, and that's just what they did. Okay, so unbeknownst to me, within months of my firing, guards were taking the severely mentally ill and torturing them in this shower chamber. And with Darren Rainey, who was about the 5th or 6th or 7th guy they did this to, they left him in there until he died. After about an hour, he collapsed. Patients that were in adjoining cells could hear him collapse. They heard him beg for his life. And when he was found, 90% of his skin had peeled off. That's what that temperature water will do to a man. Okay, so I swung into action. You know, when I was in prison, I didn't sit by and go with the program then. And sure as shit, out of prison, I wasn't going along with it either. So this is what I did. I had a face-to-face meeting with FBI agents. I sat down and I described everything that I described to you. They passed on an investigation. I thought the whole point of an investigation was to get more information. They passed. I wrote to a crime reporter for the Miami Herald. Never heard back. I filed a complaint with the Department of Justice. Got a nice form letter. Thanks for your complaint. I called the coroner on a regular basis at least 24 times about when is the autopsy report going to be ready. It wasn't ready until 3.5 years later, after this man had been killed. And that's about 6 months ago. So that gives you an idea real time what's happening. It still has not been made public. And we heard from somebody on the inside who kind of leaked some details that it found Darren Rainey's death to be accidental, and that his skin peeled off from warm, moist conditions. If that were the case, none of us would go and take a bath, okay? So, and the other thing it said was he died from complications of schizophrenia. You don't die from schizophrenia. Okay, so people in Miami who've been following this, and I've been following this, we're outraged. And, you know, this is just another case where they're trying to sweep it under the rug, cover it up, and June 23rd was the 4-year anniversary of his death. I was in New York at the time. I flew back to Miami to participate in a protest rally in front of State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle's office. We had a nice turnout and we got good press, and as a consequence, she promised that in mid-August, so this could be days away, she's going to make an announcement. We're not very optimistic, to tell you the truth. We would like her to convene a grand jury and let the people hear the facts and decide if they want to indict these 2 officers who put Darren Rainey into the shower. I think it's the only way to go. If she comes out and says, well, there's not enough evidence and the autopsy report is accidental, I think I'm going to hit the roof. I mean, this is just another of one of many of these types of situations that I've been privy to since I've gone deeper into this issue. So this is what's happening real time. One of my objectives as a psychotherapist is to focus on the severely mentally ill. And that's a segment that makes up 20% of the mass incarceration population. And we know statistically 60% of all incarcerated men and women suffer some form of mental health issue that requires treatment at least once a year. Okay, that's a high percentage. 20% of the total are the severely mentally ill, and at any given time, 5% of this entire figure are actively psychotic. We do not have enough psychiatric beds in our state, federal, and local county jails to deal with the severely mentally ill. So what happens is, more often than not, they're thrown into solitary, which is contraindicated for the severely mentally ill. So my effort here is to convince legislators, our leaders, to fund programs of early intervention in our communities and school system. Because if we get to people early in life, we stabilize them, we treat them, we turn them into productive members of society. When they go untreated for years and years, they become a burden. They end up on our Social Security disability rolls. And so my emphasis is really, there are 3 parts to this. Programs of early intervention, starting as early as 1st grade. And what I'm speaking about there is to put a wellness component into our school curriculums. Let's start teaching our kids about physical health, mental health. Let's teach them the relationship between thoughts, behaviors, emotions. Let's give them some tools to live their lives by, to solve problems instead of just reacting and getting into trouble. Let's up our game in that sense. And many of you know that ADD, attention deficit disorder, is one of the most overly diagnosed disorders in the nation right now, and it's boys that are getting this diagnosis more than girls. Boys are naturally active. Okay, let's try some common sense approaches first. Let's look at their diet. Let's have a nutritionist in our schools. It's going to help that family to change the diet. What if that kid starts his day off with a bowl full of sugared cereal? Okay, how's that going to help him to be calm? Let's have an exercise physiologist on staff. Maybe this boy just sits around, he doesn't do anything all day long. Okay, let's get him on a team. Let's get him playing sports. Let's do something constructive with all that energy. In other words, let's do the common sense approach first before we go to the meds. Makes sense. So, I will say this much about medication and children. I've seen it work. In addition to the prison psychiatric setting, I worked in a middle school setting for an agency that provided a very structured environment for at-risk children. They were labeled severely emotionally disturbed and emotionally handicapped. And so they provided counseling. I was the counselor. They provided a psychiatrist to administer medication when needed. And they provided teachers that were trained in this model. And these kids literally could not be contained in a normal classroom. They were just way too disruptive. And our program was the program of last resort, because if they didn't turn around in our program, they were sent to a more restrictive setting. And of course we end up, you've heard of the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
Okay, kids that act out and are out of control end up in that pipeline. We were helping those children. And even though I was only there 2 years before the housing debacle and the bubble burst, we would have kids that would come back as adults, and they would talk to the teachers that had been there for 20 years, and they would say, I graduated from college. I've got a good job now. If it wasn't for you guys, I don't know where I would be. Okay, so this is a program that was making a difference. And what happened is when the tax rolls just declined and there was no more money for the school defunded that program. And that's the Dade County Public School System, the 4th largest in the United States. That program no longer exists, nor does any similar program to deal with these children in Dade County. So this school to pipeline, prison, some ratio there is made up of these kids who are not getting treatment. And when we don't teach children about mental health and how to deal with it, we run the risk of continuing the stigma that's attached to mental illness. And mental illness and physical illness should have parity. Okay? I'll give you an example. Somebody who is paranoid schizophrenic, they need to stay on their meds pretty much the rest of their life, just like somebody with diabetes. There's no difference. In fact, I'll give you an example of a man I met who suffered. Well, he'll tell you that he's in permanent recovery. He's about 24 now. He had graduated high school and he was having problems, but he managed to graduate magna cum laude. Really super bright guy. So he went down the tubes after high school. He lost all of his friends. They couldn't get him treatment initially, but his mother would not give up on him. Finally, he went on medication, he got counseling, he got support groups. He went to college and got a degree in psychiatric nursing. And now he's actually working with people like himself. And he's dedicated to that kind of work. And what he illustrates is somebody who benefits from counseling, medication when needed, early intervention. It's a well-known fact that half of all adults who suffer from lifelong mental illness had symptoms by the age of 14. I was seeing that. 75% of all adults in that category had signs by the age of 24. This is a vastly underserved population. So as a psychotherapist, this is my main objective. So I'd like to just read a little bit out of my book, and Carl, if I can borrow your copy of my book.
I was wondering where your book was.
Thank you for bringing it. This particular chapter I have to look in the index, because, all right, let's see. This particular chapter is called Fighting Dragons. And I want to preface this by explaining my coworker Carmen to you. She, for all intents and purposes, grew up in Harlem, and I think that if not for this job, we would have never met. And we were so, I guess you could say, exactly opposite. I mean, I'm a white guy, she's African American, she's about 15, 16 years older than I am. When I was playing tennis in Miami Beach as a teenager, she was marching with Angela Davis on issues that she agreed with, she told me, because, you know, Angela could be out there, apparently. And the other thing that I used to tell people, they'd say, how are you surviving prison? You know, because people, they don't know. If they've never been on the inside, they don't know how it is. They just assume it's a seriously awful place. And of course it is. And I said, you know what? I'm working with a tall Whoopi Goldberg. And that was Carmen. Carmen got me by, and the two of us, on a daily basis, had a back and forth, and sometimes we would make each other laugh so hard that we would cry, and we would be gasping for air. It was just phenomenal. And I credit her for keeping me sane and helping me through that whole mess. And she's become one of the most significant women in my life now. We're really great friends, and I love her like crazy, and I speak to her on a weekly basis. So let me just read this chapter, and then we'll turn it over. Carmen, that video gives me a sick feeling, no matter how many times I see it. We sat down after a long day at the annual DOC training across the street at the women's prison. You ain't kidding, that dude suffered. Carmen went online. Here he is, Timothy Joe Suiters, shoplifting, mentally ill, stabbed himself 7 times in the stomach. Jesus, this guy's fucked up. Bipolar, psychotic, attempted suicide 3 times. Sounds exactly like some of the guys we have in here. After the video, Sergeant Holmes said guards at that Michigan prison didn't even follow their own protocols. Suiters never should have been put in a suicide cell watch for disciplinary reasons. For sure, George. Had him in 4-point restraints on a steel bed without a mattress for 4 days. Naked and soaked in his own urine, and the heat index was 106 degrees. Says here he broke a sprinkler earlier and flooded his cell. Shit, that happens all the time around here. At least we don't go killing people over it. Oh, here's something else. 60 Minutes did a piece on him a while back. Oh yeah, I remember seeing that. They tried to draw attention to the shitty treatment the mentally ill get in prison. Ironic that I'm working with the same kind of people. Get this. Michigan DOC said they were following procedures, but 60 Minutes found they kept him in restraints 17 hours longer than they were supposed to. I think guards in TCU can't keep patients restrained for more than a couple of hours, maybe less. That's such bullshit. Same old pack of lies, same old worn out story. We were following procedure. But the poor guy died. What kind of fucking procedure is that? This is interesting. Michigan paid out $3.25 million to Suiters' family in a wrongful death settlement. Once again, taxpayers foot the bill for the guards' fuck up. And how about all the nurses who kept checking him and then leaving without so much as a peep. Like, can't they say, get this guy out of here, he's not doing well? Thought of that too. Even when it comes to a medical issue, I guess nobody wants to go up against security. Just like here, Carmen, poor Samantha found that out. She didn't stand a chance when they turned their sights on her. Michigan guards probably blamed somebody else for Suter's death. My guess is that they threw those nurses under the bus. What I don't get is that Suter's was totally calmed down and they still left him there. Even the original flawed reason for putting him in isolation wasn't a factor anymore. Guards got to take the blame at that point. Your reasoning is sound. What troubles me is how everybody just sat by and watched Suter's slipping away. It's barbaric. This is a case of where a short sentence turns into a death sentence. It's legalized murder, or at least institutional manslaughter. Probably their attitude was like, let's teach this guy a lesson. I'd go along with that. Fuck, you're not going to believe this. Here's what his mother said, and I quote, "It was January in wintertime, and you know, he was running around outside with his clothes off, thinking he was a knight fighting dragons. You know, it's you lose touch with reality." She goes on to say his troubles didn't start until his late teens when he started acting strangely. How many times have we talked about that? Mental patients who should be in a psych facility, not prison. Too many times to count. Late teens, his mother said. That's typical for the onset of schizophrenia. His constellation of symptoms would probably support that diagnosis. Thing is, when I hear about something like that, my school counseling experience gets me wondering how he fell through the cracks. There's a ton of reason, George, but one thing's for certain, the system ain't working. In his case, it seems like there were plenty places to interfere in his timeline, but for whatever reason, nothing or very little was done. There are so many people barely existing who are so mentally fucked up they can't hold down a job or even have a place to live. So what do we do with them? We put him in prison when they get caught stealing food or something. Remember Haynes, that little black guy who claims he's an astronaut and neurosurgeon? Oh sure, George. He was on my caseload for a couple of years before you got here. He says some crazy shit, totally delusional. He was talking about his case the other day and said prosecutors offered him 5 years for shoplifting. Haynes told me it was a case of mistaken identity, so he turned it down and went to trial. Of course, we know what happened. Do you know when his EOS date is? He gets out a long, long time from now, if I remember correctly. Checked his chart. Gets out in 2089. What the fuck? He would have been out already if he accepted the deal. He's 49 years old, for Christ's sakes. They gave him a life sentence for all intents and purposes. But that's besides the point. He's mentally ill and never should have been here in the first place. He'll be warehoused in TCU until he dies. One thing's for sure, he can't ever be put out on the compound. He'd be eaten alive. Sweet little guy like that, he'd be somebody's fuckboy in a minute. He never comes out of his cell, even for rec. When I drop by for our session, his cell is empty except for his bedding and a few clothes. No books, no puzzles, no pictures, nothing. He's one of those most pitiful guys we have in here, just sitting in his cell all day long alone with his thoughts. I know what you mean. Always hoped he passed his time immersed in some rich delusional fantasy. His internal life could be quite amazing for all we know. Hope so, Carmen. That's a better way to look at it. In his delusion, maybe he's performing brain surgery on some hot alien babe as they're traveling the speed of light to the Andromeda galaxy. There you go, and she probably has 4 tits. 4 more, and she'd be a centerfold in Playboy universe. Speaking of hot babes, did you see how they were looking at you when you walked through the yard to the training? Hot babes? You better go get your eyes checked, woman. Maybe there were 2 of that many, and one looked like she was a lesbian. All I know is they looked at you like a hungry tigress with a plate of raw meat in front of her. Homestead hotties had you in their sights, you big hunk of man flesh. All the heads were turning at the same time, but they sure as shit weren't looking in my direction. Damn, missed that. It'd be a boost to my ego, except it's like the Hunchback of Notre Dame checking you out. Haven't had any in so long. Quasimodo be looking real good about now. Carmen growled lasciviously. Come here, baby. Let me rub your hump. Now you've gone too far. You know how visual I am. My sex life is shot till I let that one go. At least you got one. This chapter illustrates a few things. What happens to the severely mentally ill? Mental illness is criminalized.
Yep.
And this, I'm not going to call it a conspiracy, but it sure looks like one when we keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome. The mentally ill are clogging our jails and prisons. And so what happens to a man like Haynes happens to 20% of the total prison population, which is anywhere from 2.2 million to 2.4 million. That's right around 400,000 or so. Programs of early intervention would reduce this number dramatically. And just to play with numbers a little bit, let's say we reduce that by 100,000. That represents the total prison population in Florida. That is a 2 billion plus a year savings if we close 56 prisons and had 100,000 people in treatment as opposed to prison. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I want to say a few words about the Revolution Books $25,000 fundraising campaign. The time is now. And first I want to thank George for his very generous donation in the form of allocating the profits from the books that are sold tonight to our campaign. We are raising $25,000. And what is this for? This is so that this bookstore can stay open and can be an even greater resource than it has been for the people of the world. Because we are serious. Humanity needs revolution. The revolution needs Revolution Books, and Revolution Books needs you. We are raising this $25,000 to expand our selection of books, to get air conditioning into this place, to get a stage so that we can have bigger and more impactful programs, to have signage outside so that people can discover this store. In short, this store has to be an even more powerful force at a time when the planet is being destroyed as global warming accelerates. And look at the books you find here. You know, scientists have now said that this will be the hottest year on record, the 4th or 5th time that this year will be the hottest year on record. And you come to this bookstore and you find Elizabeth Colbert's book on the 6th extinction. You find James Hansen's books on global warming, and he's the expert on that. And you also find the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America, written by Bob Avakian, which is the blueprint and the framework for creating a society based on overthrowing this system, creating a society that can actually interact with nature in a sustainable way. So that's what you discover here. This bookstore has to be supported because of the books you find here. The Subway Art by Henry Chalfant. The best selection of James Baldwin in New York City. This bookstore has to be supported. Just look at the programs of the last 3 weeks. We had a program right in the wake of the brutal murders of those young black men in Baton Rouge and St. Paul, Minnesota. A few bad cops or something deeper. And we got into what it is about the nature of the system that results in what happens to black youth into mass incarceration that's talked about here. We had a program in the wake of the conventions entitled Overthrow, Don't Vote for the System. And we got into what the elections are about. We got into the political structure of this system. And we got into what it means to be building a movement for revolution today. And then we had a program with the Yale art scholar, Susan Kahn, talking about her book, Mounting Frustration, Mounting Frustration, Art in the Age of Black Power. And then look at our website for this campaign, the Indiegogo campaign. And the way you find that website is by going to revolutionbooksnyc.org, and then you click on the Indiegogo donate button. You click on the Indiegogo campaign button right at the top. And go to that website and see the testimonials, see the videos from the people who have volunteered at this store, young people, and how this store has changed their lives. People who have discovered this new communism and who are getting into it, studying it, and who are helping to build and promote a bookstore that is not just a bookstore, but this incredibly exciting political, intellectual, and cultural center for a movement for revolution. And this now is getting out there. I want to announce that just yesterday, the American Booksellers Association, which is the preeminent trade association of bookstores, did a profile on Revolution Books and our campaign to raise $25,000. But here's the brute and naked truth. We are not where we need to be in this campaign. We're on the home stretch. We've raised over $8,000, but we got to get to $25,000 very soon. And that means we have to get the word out. We have to project this more widely. We have to ramp it up. And we need to reach out to people who can make big donations, and we need to reach out to all kinds of people who can donate, and help get this out more widely. So I want to say that there are 3 critical things that people can do. 1, they can donate. And as I said, you can go to revolutionbooksnyc.org and click on that button. And you can go to the back of the room, and there's a computer where you can get online very quickly and in the company of wonderful colleagues and friends here. 2, I want to call attention, Connie, I don't know, 3 important visual artists have donated incredible works of art. I mean, amazing. But then you have to judge for yourself. But this is really amazing stuff, and one of the works is hanging over here by Dred Scott. But the 3 artists are Dred Scott, Kyle Goen, and Derek Adams. That work is, what's up there? I can't see. That's Dred Scott's Triangle Fire, right? This is something that someone from the bookstore can talk with people about. It's referencing a historical episode in which women, textile workers, women clothing workers, perished in a fire in a sweatshop. Now, those works are available. They have been donated, and those works are selling from anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000. If you know people that are art collectors, aficionados, or foundations or other institutions that could purchase that, you need to get to us. This is a very vital asset in this campaign right now. And third, people here can be part of the outreach, the phone banking, and the going to meet people, to talk, and to help set up meetings where representatives from the bookstore can sit down with people. So this is what we're doing with this campaign. And as we say, without Revolution Books, the world stays as it is. It's just that serious. And that's why we must win this campaign, and all of you can be part of enabling us, all of us in this room, and all of those in this neighborhood, and all of us in this city, and all the people around the world who count on this store to be the beacon of revolution that it is, and that it must be, in an even more impactful way. So let's go forward with this campaign, and with that, I'm going to call Carl Dix up to the stage to sit up here with George, and we're going to have a conversation and then open it up to the audience. Okay? Thank you.
That sounded good.
All right, that sounds better. Like George said, the book actually does start with "they killed him," and it goes into the murder of Darren Rainey. And you can't call it anything other than that. I remember hearing about this when it broke, and they took this man who had very serious mental problems, and as punishment for how he acted in relation to that, they put him in a cell that was a shower and almost boiling, not quite, but they were up close to it, and just left him in there, ran the water and left him. Heard him crying out in pain, saying, "No more of this, I'll stop, I won't do it anymore." So I can't call that anything but murder. But then the book steps back and it goes through George's experience, both at the middle school, and then it goes to the prison and really focuses on the prison. And you see the relationship between just the everyday abuse and brutality that the people in the prison suffer. And then that situates this murder in a different context, a context of a long train of abuses, and it's just one of degree, you know, but the same thing was going on. So that's the thing that really hit me about reading this, and I really recommend people check it out. So I wanted to start with that, but then where I wanted to take our conversation is you focus on mental illness and incarceration.
Yes.
And you talk about the rise in the number of people with mental illness who are incarcerated. And you touch on, I think you referred to the 1960s as a period when that rise began. And I really think it's important to take the lens back and look at this. Because you said, well, conspiracy and you weren't committal. I mean, to me, it's not a conspiracy when they do the shit right out in the open. No, and that's what they did. Think back on the people being pushed out of mental illness facilities. I remember a big surge of it in the Reagan years.
Yeah, and
So I
ironically,
wanted to,
he was shot by somebody who was severely mentally ill. You know, so if he kept these facilities open, and they were closed supposedly for humanitarian reasons, so instead of improving them, they just closed them. And in their place, there was supposed to be funding for community mental health treatment centers. That never happened. Politicians never funded that. So where did these people go? They were just basically put out on the streets. And so you can imagine the severely mentally ill, left to their own devices, they got into trouble. And that's how they ended up in prison. And now we're looking at, that was like 50 years ago. And if you look at the Republican platform and the Democratic platform, the Republicans offer nothing. They say they have some awareness of the issue, but they don't offer anything solid. The Democrats at least have a few things that are on their platform about the mentally ill. But in my mind, this is only the first step in a journey of 1,000 miles. We should be at the 500-mile mark by now. We're so far behind. Why is it taking 50 years to get a handle on this problem? That's how I see this, Carl. We're just not doing enough.
Okay, I guess I see it in terms of a system that really has large numbers of people that it has little or no use for.
Very true.
And there's the mentally ill. There are also large numbers of people in the inner cities, especially black and brown people, whose ancestors filled a certain role, not a favored role in society, but a productive role. You know, because, I mean, at one point, the wealth and power of this country was founded on enslaving people from Africa and working them for nothing. Then slavery ended, but slavery by another name, and sharecropping, locked on the same plantations. Then when that ended, it was being the bottom tier of a urban manufacturing workforce. But now that manufacturing is halfway around the world, you know, and you're left with large numbers of people that the system no longer has a use for. And one question I did want to ask you, because I'm figuring there's some overlap between the mentally ill and the oppressed nationality, people, black, Latino, other oppressed nationalities who have been pushed out of productive roles in the system and are gone at through the criminal injustice system. But I don't know exactly how that fits together. I don't know if you do or not.
Well, what we're seeing, and this pretty much started with politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, bending over backward to outdo one another in their tough on crime stance. And so they enacted ever more draconian laws to put more and more people in prison. And I suspect part of that was motivated by private prison enterprises who can afford millions of dollars to support lobbyists and these politicians in their campaign runs. So laws were developed and they targeted people of color. And this, according to Miss Alexander, who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, is a conspiracy. And in that group of people were drug addicts and the severely mentally ill. So instead of spending money on treatment for drug addiction or treatment for severe mental illness, our prisons became repositories for these two groups. Our prisons are now warehousing the severely mentally ill. There's no plan to do anything substantial about it. So this is why we're seeing this segment of the severely mentally ill. It's at 20% now. I predict in a couple of years it'll be 25% or 30%. We're still not doing enough to keep these people out of prison. And here's another thing about poverty. Poverty itself is psychologically debilitating. Because when you've got you're constantly scraping for dollars to pay the rent and to provide food for your children, and you're working two jobs, and finally they're raising the minimum wage, but it's not going to be enough because the cost of living index has risen. So these people that are still working two jobs and worrying about their kids, that's going to continue. Meanwhile, their kids are left by themselves to figure life out. They get into trouble. And again, that's another cycle from that school to prison pipeline. They don't have parental oversight and guidance because their parents are out working. And so this is what poverty does to people. And I think the figures now are 40 million live under the poverty line, or it's even more. And this is a great source for the criminal justice system to keep that engine rolling right along. And when I did a little research into men on my caseload, I looked into their charts. Of the hundreds and hundreds that I counseled, only 3 went to college. 1 graduated. Most of them dropped out in middle school, high school. I saw 10th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, occasional 11th grade, but they dropped out. And here's another statistics I came across. 60 to 70% of all people who are incarcerated are functionally illiterate.
Wow.
Okay, so
Yes.
this staggered me when I read that, and it makes sense that we should have programs to teach people how to read. Because if you can't read a job application, how are you going to get a job? You know, how are you going to exist in life? And I can tell you, I had, like that Haynes, who was on my caseload, he couldn't read either. That's why he didn't have any books in his cell. And so many of the men that were on my caseload suffered from that as well. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but
No, that gets into it.
Yeah.
I just want to pose one other thing, because I think we got to talk a little bit about what are we going to do about this?
yes.
How is this going to be stopped? To get into that, I want to read this thing from your book. It's actually towards the end. You talk about 6 guards and 2 assistant wardens and a warden who were involved in the death of a prisoner, a Mr. Walker. And they not only didn't get punished for it, the warden, Tom Reed, was given the Secretary's Leadership Award,
Oh,
which recognizes a warden who consistently exemplifies the department's values.
that was staggering. And what happened was, this warden, when he was the warden of this particular prison, had his men wake up inmates under his care in the middle of the night for no reason. And so they woke up this one guy, Matthew Walker, an African American, and this was a big guy, 250 pounds. Trust me, I would not be waking that guy up for nothing. Okay, so they go into his cell, like 4 or 5 guards, and he reacts by trying to protect himself. And he ended up knocking out a few of these guards, but you know, he was overwhelmed. And they ended up crushing his larynx, and they killed him. And then of course they cleaned up the crime scene, like they cleaned up the crime scene for Darren Rainey. And so when it went to a grand jury, at least it made it that far, everything was so convoluted and conflicting stories, and the evidence wasn't there. And plus, here's something else that happens with grand juries, is that there's an advisor paid for by the state attorney that advises members of the grand jury. And so they were advised that they didn't have enough evidence to go forward. And do you know that a grandmother on that grand jury broke the seal of silence, and she came forward and said, we wanted to convene, we wanted to press charges, but this guy told us it wouldn't stick, so we didn't. Okay, and this is just not an isolated example. And the joke I kind of made when I was working in prison was, beat an inmate, get promoted. And this was before all these stories came out, and I thought I was just being funny, and it turned out to be real. It turned out to be real. One of the regional directors, when he was a warden, he had something called the program, and they used chemical agents, in other words, pepper spray, to supposedly control the population. And they just pick people by random and put them in a cell and just spray them, until they collapsed. And this is what's happening in our prison system. And that's got to change. We've got to get to this culture of brutality.
Okay, I brought that up because you think about these incidents and you figure the guards who carry this out, there's a basic lack of humanity in how they go about it, what they do. But that's not the heart of the problem. The problem is much deeper than that. If a warden who oversees a murder then gets an award talking about he exemplifies the values of our Department of Corrections, and they're not saying he exemplifies when we have to change these values, they're upholding that and lauding it. Or the people who carry it out get promoted. Like a lot of the cops who brutalize and murder people on the street end up not only not getting punished, but promoted and rewarded. And it actually comes down to, we're dealing with a system that has these horrors built into its fabric and framework. And look, and this is a discussion, I don't want to get deeply off into this right now tonight, or unless the audience wants to bring it up. But that's why we in the Revolutionary Communist Party are organizing right now for an actual revolution. One that overthrows this system and brings a different world into being, a different society, one where we can deal with these problems. And I just want to draw briefly from the Constitution for a New Socialist Republic that Raymond referenced, which was written by Bob Avakian, and it talks about legal and civil rights and liberties. And in discussing the question of this under a socialist economic system, it talks about a society where the right to employment and income is guaranteed, and that's what's being constructed. And for these reasons, common crime has ceased to be a major social problem, but it also recognizes that it won't be immediately eliminated, and that we'd have to deal with questions like crime, incarceration, mental illness, but we'd have to do it in a totally different way. It would have to start with, we're dealing with human beings here.
Yes.
That's one starting point. And we would have to say, we've got problems around mental illness. That's not going to go away either. That might be a much better society where you didn't have to worry about, would you have a job? Would you be able to eat? Would you have housing? And that might lessen the stress, but it's not going to take mental illness away. And I don't know if this is something you've ever thought about, but we're going to need people with your training, your experience, and your understanding to contribute to, okay, in that kind of society, how would you deal with mental illness? How would you deal with where it might intersect with criminal activity? What should prisons be like? How could we ensure that there would not be abuse of authority in it? And I know in your book you talk about training, independent oversight, and accountability.
Yes.
But in this society, with its aim of maximizing profit in the hands and pockets of a few, that doesn't get exercised in relation to ensuring that those on the bottom of society aren't being abused and fucked over. And we'd have to go at it entirely different. I don't know if that's something you've ever thought about. Maybe it's something for a later discussion that we can have.
I actually think about that a lot, and I think the first step is to deprivatize prisons, because once you introduce profit motive into the prison system, you're going to get lousy services, and in my unit, these men were in isolation. In other words, they were locked down 24/7. They came out for counseling, medical, rec, and a group. So we need to have a completely different treatment paradigm within our prison system to address the mentally ill. Because as I said, if they're leaving prison worse off than when they come in, that's definitely not a good thing. And what I had in mind are repurposed prisons that are more like residential treatment facilities, where qualified patients And it could be on a merit system. In other words, if you wanted a less restrictive setting as an inmate and you were suffering from mental illness, maybe, you know, you'd have to stay on your medication. But what I have in mind is where the guards aren't even dressed like guards anymore. They're more like orderlies. And the important thing here is, let's get back to respect. Because if they're treated with respect, men and women will respond. And they'll stay on their medication. They'll be more compliant with the mental health programming. Okay, so if we can turn people around and then get them treatment out on the street when they EOS, which is end of sentence, we have a hope of stabilizing these people and keeping them from what is now the revolving door, where people are worse off than when they went in. They come out, they recommit a crime, then they're thrown in again, they're even worse off, and they just continually provide fodder for these private prison companies. And as I said, these private prison companies, they know what's happening, okay? But they're sitting on the sidelines. And this is just something that affects their bottom line. They will not talk about mental health initiatives, because that would reduce the prison population and their profits. They're not talking about programs of rehabilitation or educational programs such as electrical contracting or anything like that, because if people get out of prison and they get a job and they don't come back, they're going to take a hit. So these private prison companies and the providers like mine, Horizon Health, they need to go, okay? Because it's just a never-ending cycle where they're just trying to make more and more money, and their business model is dependent on amassing live bodies for profit. I mean, I don't think there's anything more. I mean, this is just something that blows my mind. It just seems vile and morally reprehensible to be dependent on that. And some of these companies actually have lobbyists / lawyers that get together with politicians and design more laws to increase the prison population. And specifically Arizona, they now have laws where I think they can pull over just about anybody of color, and they're ending up in detention camps there, which is money for these private concerns. So we've got to do that first. That's the biggest step.
Okay, I think that's an important step. I'm going to go to the audience, but one quick comment. You made a point, a very correct point, that it isn't just the prisons in Florida, it's nationwide. There's not a prison in this country that you don't have these problems. And here in New York City, we've got Rikers Island. 15,000 people there on average every day. And it has the same kind of brutality and even murder that you talked about. They did a study and documented 129 cases of severe brutality in 1 year alone, and no guards punished for any of it. And see, it's actually very well cameraed. So some of the brutality that they were documenting was on video, and the guards still got away with it. It's entirely public, private.
You know,
so they're doing the same thing there.
And that's like Rodney King. We saw him being beaten. Oh, and here's a quick note. Milton Grimes, who is Rodney King's attorney, he is now taken on the wrongful death lawsuit for Darren Rainey's family.
Wow.
Okay, I'm going to go to the audience.
Okay.
Okay, first the brother there with the cap on, then we'll come up to the...
Hey, I listened to a podcast, I forgot which governor it was, but he was talking a bit about the difference, I guess, private sector prisons versus public sector. And for him, he said that he chose private sector prisons over public sector because they were essentially doing the same job, but they would do it cheaper than some of the public sector prisons would have done. And he felt like if he was just as a statesman, you know, why would he not choose the cheaper of the positions if they were offering the same and they had the same quality? But just to your point, you said to privatize the prisons. So I just want to ask, what is the public sector prisons doing that is far superior than the private sector prisons? Thank you.
Well, I don't think that, it is a sort of a comparison, apples to apples in a way, because in the private prisons, there's less accountability. So, it's difficult enough to find out what's happening behind the public prisons, but private prisons keep that covered up. And if you were to Google the corporation, the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, you would find a lot of material on human rights abuses. And so they're not clean. These are not clean. And one of my patients did say that in one isolated experience in a private prison he was in Florida, which there are 6 of the 56, a guard was getting out of line and going through the whole abuse thing, and another guard pulled him aside and said, "We don't do that here." And that got me to thinking, if this is addressing the bottom line of a private prison, they don't want to get sued for that stuff. So I was kind of thinking, well, maybe they're not so bad. But then I did some research and found all these human rights abuses. So, the privatizing everything is I don't think, the answer.
We'll go there and then.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for writing the book. I enjoyed it. And it was really eye-opening, even though I thought I knew a lot about mental illness, and it just heightened what I knew and something I didn't know. So let's visualize after the revolution, and I was thinking about this while y'all were talking, and people tried to address the mental issue. Those same people, if they still around, is going to come and apply for those same jobs. What would you say to them, those guys, and even the therapist who has a deaf ear on this is business as usual, go along with the program? How would you address those people?
Well, one of the things that happens in Florida, and I suspect that this is also nationwide, is that new recruits don't undergo any psychological screening. So we don't know who we're getting in the prison system, and Florida is one of the worst prisons in terms of the wages that they pay correctional officers. And I want to say that there are many fine correctional officers in the system. I had the pleasure of working with one that I profiled in my book, and we need a lot more of those people. Now here's the thing that happens with these good officers as well. They're afraid of retaliation. And you know what? They will not come forward and speak about the abuses that they witness. So this deeply entrenched brutality, and it's multi-generational, is like a cancer, and it's an out-of-control cancer.
Okay, I really feel like, in fact, I thought you were asking me the question.
Oh, go ahead.
He contributed to the answer. Look, we are going to have to totally reorient prisons.
Yes.
Because they'll play a different role. They will not be part of the controlling of people that the society no longer has any use for. It will actually be, first off, people only end up in prison. It's not a punishment thing. It should be a thing of, this is someone who has damaged society in some way, and we can't win them to see that they shouldn't do that, and they have to be confined and rehabilitated and won over time to see that they shouldn't do it. That would be the mission of people working in the prisons, from the guards, the supervisory people, the health people, the food services, the educational people. That would be the mission. And frankly, we'd have to fire everybody who worked in a prison. And see, I appreciated your breakdown of people like Officer Ling,
Right.
who was, I think, one of the good
He was.
officers that
He
you're
was.
talking about, except that because of the way things were set up, he would not dime on the bad officers. And see, here's how I approach this in relation to it. Don't tell me you're good if you're watching the bad guys do all of this shit, but you can't move yourself to say, I have to call this out. And I say the same thing about police officers out here. Because look, I know with the NYPD, they have like 30-some thousand people. New York Police Department, 30-some thousand people. 2,000 of them are the serial killers and brutalizers. That's been studied, and they found out that there's actually all of this brutality, all of this killing, it's only done by 2,000 officers. But the problem is, the other 30,000 stand by while it happens, are part of a blue wall of silence, keeping it from being exposed. And then some of them go down to the fucking, because Marley Graham's murder, or the cop who murdered Marley Graham up in the Bronx, actually got put on trial. The charge got thrown out. Hundreds of cops went down and cheered him. You the man. Well, what did he do? He killed the black teenager in his own house, in the bathroom in his own house, in front of his grandmother and younger brother. That's nothing to cheer. And it reflects something. So all these other cops, they weren't pulling the trigger, but they were cheering on the one that did. So you have to actually break that up and bring forward a whole different workforce, charge them with a totally different mission, give them the training to carry out that mission, and make it very clear that no, brutality and abuse will not be covered up in this setup. You know, and Bob Avakian, in talking about the police and the role they would play in a revolutionary society, has said we're going to have a public security force where the officers would sooner lose their own lives than kill or injure an innocent person. Okay, now that's real different than today, because cops today kill somebody and all I got to do is say the 3 magic words, I feared for my life. Oh, that's more than 3 words, but anyway. And they get off on it. So we'd have to have a similar thing for people in prison. This is what your mission is. Train them to carry out that mission and make it very clear that don't fuck over people, because you will suffer punishment, an appropriate level of punishment, depending on what the exact circumstances of the fucking over people was. That's what I think would be required to do that. And also, you'd have to be situated in what the whole society was about, which was unleashing people to work to abolish exploitation and oppression once and for all, and then figuring out, well, how does that apply to prison? How does that apply to dealing with the question of crime? How does that apply to mental illness? And what would be the way in which we're contributing to bringing that kind of society into being, one where exploitation, oppression, and the horrors of capitalism, imperialism are things of the past, things that people can read about in books or watch videos about, but no longer have to suffer themselves. Okay.
You're gonna have a problem with the speaker if you come up here. You're appealing to him.
No problem. No problem with that.
Good evening, my name is Anna.
Hi.
Thank you, George. Thank you for the book. I was invited by George. I am a mother that works for solitary confinement in Pennsylvania. And the question is the same thing. We are having a lot of issues with solitary confinements. A lot of inmates, mental illness has been in solitary confinement for 20 years, 30 years. My son has been down for 9 years in solitary confinement for something he didn't even do, because they don't want to snitch. They live by that code. You can't snitch in prison because you wind up dead. I've been doing this for 16 years, and as a mother, I was banned from visiting my son, and I'm STG, a COVID. And I go out there a lot, and it's the same issue. We talk about the mental issue in solitary confinement. I work very close with Africa, Pat Africa, Bishop Pat's brother just passed away, in the same facility that my son is. My William is the same in the same facility my son is. DCOs are torching our loved one behind bars. And it seems like there's nobody cares, and then we have to fight harder and harder. I'm leaving today at midnight. Tomorrow, I get to see my son after 9 years. Yes, and it's a special place. It's hard, because he'll be 38, and it's been 17 years that I don't hold my son. And I bring this, I'm from the Bronx, but my legwork is for Mothers Against Solitary Confinement in Pennsylvania. So I got a lot of inmates that I do their legwork because they don't have a voice. And this is what we see and we fight. We have to be their voice. We can't be scared. So we have to find a solution. How could we stop the COs from torturing our family?
You know, I actually thought about that a lot and came up with a solution. And what we need to do is to take the grievance process away from these Department of Corrections. And what I mean by that is that what happens now, if an inmate grieves an officer and says, this officer is running a drug ring, or this officer has brutalized this inmate, so on and so forth, what will happen is that grievance is read by, in Florida it's called classification, but often the officers are dating the woman in classification that's reading the grievance. So the grievance gets back to the officer, and then the inmate is retaliated against. What these officers do is they trump up the charges, and they'll put them into solitary on fiction. And so my solution is this. Let's go to the people who really know what is happening on the inside. If we take the grievance process out of the hands of these Department of Corrections and put it in the hands of an independent agency, then if inmates knew that they wouldn't be retaliated against, we would find out who the bad officers are. But I would even go a step further and have an edition called the Personnel Appreciation Form. And so this would give inmates a chance to say, hey, you know, Sergeant Smith, he's a stand-up guy. Let's pay that guy some more money. Let's attach it to some tangible reward. Let's pay the good people and get rid of the bad people. And in Florida, there's a woman that runs a website called Forgotten Majority. And she gets all sorts of letters and information and phone calls from contraband cell phones from inmates who name the guards that are doing abuses, drug rings, so on and so forth. And she says that 85% of the reports are accurate. And given the fact that these inmates would suffer a high price in retaliation, she thinks that they're truthful. And so this is a way that we could address this from the inside. Now, getting a secretary of the Department of Corrections to go along with it, that's a whole nother story. I think it has to be legislated. And, you know, when I speak to legislators, I give them my essay on that, which is, of course, far more detailed than I mentioned here. But it's a way of doing it from the inside out. It's never been tried before. And as Carl said, we got to go about this differently, because if we just keep doing the same thing expecting a different outcome, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just say this about solitary confinement. Long-term solitary confinement in itself is torture and
Yes.
mental torture.
Yes.
The mind begins to break down if you're held in solitary confinement over an extended period of time. And internationally, I think it's a couple of weeks is the limit, and you go beyond that, it's considered a crime. It's considered torture, which is an international crime. And we live in a society where they subject people to that for decades.
But not in Pennsylvania, because it's a Commonwealth state.
No, the U.S. doesn't abide by that.
Okay.
In the United States, people have been put in solitary confinement for decades. And just believe me, I know solitary confinement is not a good place to
No.
be, because I've done some of it myself when I refused to go to Vietnam and was in Leavenworth. I spent half the time in solitary
I'm going to see my
confinement.
son tomorrow after 9 years. I don't even know if he's
I'm really
met
glad
me.
for you.
I
'Cause
don't know if his mind. I don't know if he's going to recognize me. I don't even know what I'm going to expect, because he's in Pittsburgh. He's an SDI Fayette. He's in one of the worst prisons in Pennsylvania. One of the worst prisons in Pennsylvania.
Where's the mic?
Hi, George.
It's hard.
I'm pretty sure you're considered a whistleblower.
That would be the case.
Have you received any retaliation, or have you been targeted as a result of this?
You know, it hasn't been overt. The one thing that really bothered me greatly was I got a Facebook friend request, and on this request was this very underage girl who was maybe 8 years old in a bikini, and it creeped me out. And I read down a little bit, and there were these men saying things like, "Oh, she's so beautiful." I was like, you know, and so I filed a report with Facebook. I took screenshots of everything, and then I posted it in my blog as a warning to other human rights activists that this could happen to you. I even went so far as to call the local FBI office and apprise them of the situation. They didn't have the resources to do anything, but at least I mentioned the officer's name in my blog, and I documented it. So that creeped me out. I get a lot of hang-up calls. So, you know, as far as I know, I mean, that's the extent of what's happening. I have no idea what's happening behind the scenes, because, you know, I'm going up against some pretty powerful forces. The private prison industry doesn't want to hear my message, and certainly I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, I'm on an FBI list or the NSA, because I'm not going along with the program, and, you know, I'm speaking out about this stuff.
One other question. How do you deprivatize these systems?
Well, for example, this private prison concern called Geo Group, they have 6 prisons in Florida. Let the contract expire. Take it back. Okay? The company I worked for, Horizon Health, and that's a misnomer, because they have over 600 malpractice lawsuits pending. Okay? We need to let that contract expire and take it back. Okay? And the way it works is this. And there were a number of these companies that I worked for. They would each get the new contract that was supposedly for 7% less than what the state could do it for. Of course, they cut services, they denied medical treatment, horror stories like you can't believe. Okay, so a new company comes in, the same workers stay. So that, you know, if we boot these companies out, we need the administrators of the prison to just step in and do a little administration for the people that are already there. The program's already there. So we don't need these private companies to make their profits on the pain and suffering of patients and inmates. And that's what's happening right now.
The first thing I wanted to say is sort of like a comment, and then a question. When you were speaking about the mental health and like the mental health and how it works in the prisons, and then how the privatization of all this runs on the fact that they're having these people keep on coming back, or keep on having this huge population of people, mental health issues, as part of them keeping up running. It reminded me a little bit of like when I was studying, when I watched Trapped and stuff, this abortion documentary about trap laws, and then how some of the trap laws were like you could have to work in this certain place and you have to have so many like people get hurt and injured there for you to stay there as a doctor. And it was just like, wow, you know, like you really see how deeply rooted, not only like the whole health sphere, but in different spheres of society, how like it's so systematically put in. And I guess my question would be like, how do we get rid of the stigma with mental health? Because it's very deep in society, and I think you know, if it was maybe less, like if people were more educated on it or something, like maybe possibly we wouldn't have so many problems. But like, how do we do that?
Right, that is just totally on target. And I mentioned programs of early intervention and a wellness component in our school curriculums as early as first grade. There are many professionals out there who can write age-appropriate material for very young kids to teach them about mental health and mental illness. And you're right, through education we can lift the stigma that's attached to mental illness now, but we've got to start it with our kids before they're already patterned with all the sort of, you know, cultural overlay that mental illness has right now. Because we make jokes about the mentally ill all the time. We're putting them down, we're stigmatizing them, we're labeling them. And if we get to children early, and I mentioned the 9-year-old girl on my caseload in my book, where she was hearing voices and she was on meds for schizophrenia. Well, if we educate our children at an early age where they're thinking, well, you know, if you hear voices, that's kind of like diabetes. You go and talk to the counselor, and it's no big deal, and all the other students are on board. And they don't look at this person as, you know, some weirdo to be bullied or stigmatized or labeled, but just, hey, this person needs help. Get them on meds. Go see a counselor. That's how we remove the stigma. We're not going to remove the stigma for people that are like my age or even younger, because, you know, we already are on board with that program of stigmatizing the severely mentally ill. So you're so on target. Education.
Hi.
Actually, there was a hand
Okay.
back there. And
Okay, so earlier Carl brought up the point about you know, we do need a whole different workforce and mission and training that goes into that, because all of this has to be situated in, you know, a model for the whole society that is centered around unleashing all people to be able to fight against all forms of oppression. I think that, you know, we would be doing the people that are in the system a disservice in a major way to overlook them when we talk about making this change that needs to happen, and, you know, focusing on the future generations, or, you know, saying that people that are already deeply entrenched in the system can't really change, I think that that would be contrary to the mission of such a society, which is to enable all human beings to be able to take up on the role of being a conscious emancipator of humanity in that sense. So, you know, you bring up the statistic about, I think was almost 60% of the prisoners in the system are illiterate. It is, you know, obviously very hard to be able to take an active role in the direction of your society if you cannot engage with it, which you can't study, you don't know what has happened or what is happening, you can't read the laws or engage with any sort of theory or revolutionary, you know, mindset, political economy, all of that stuff is just kind of above you, but it shouldn't have to be just because that is the situation that people are in now. So even while we're actually hastening toward a situation where we can go for a full revolution and change the whole system that gives rise to these sort of inequalities and perpetuates this horrible system that we're talking about, where is the focus on the prisoners themselves, actually getting them, you know, getting them the education they need, getting them the tools they need, getting them to realize, to activate themselves as in a sense, a social basis for an actual revolution, because they shouldn't actually be left out of the equation just because they're currently not in society in that sense. And they can influence a lot as well, because we hear from them, we see what's going on with them. If they're also engaged in the struggle just the way that we are, then it's not so much doing to them, what can be done to them, but what's actually coming from that as well. Understanding that these are human beings, and there is a lot of potential for them also to be able to change the direction of society for themselves and for other people. Understanding that this is society overall that gives rise to their situation. So I guess I didn't really ask a question in all of that, but if you want to comment on any of that.
Carly, well, I'll comment briefly on it. I mean, look, one of the things that does need to happen is people who are imprisoned need to be unleashed to be a part of struggling around bringing a new world into being. And I mean, one thing that we do is there's an effort called the Prisoners Revolutionary Literature Fund that we support wholeheartedly, and it sends copies of Revolution newspaper into the prisons free, and it also sends other revolutionary literature. And that's an important part of reaching to people who can't be out in the society, but can be a part of the struggle. And I know that actually from my own experience, because when I refused to go to Vietnam and got sent to Leavenworth, the first thing I felt is like, there's a revolution going on out there. I can't wait till I get out and be a part of it. And then I realized, well, why do I have to wait? There's shit that we got to do stuff around in prison. We can be reading revolutionary theory, and we found that some people couldn't read. This was like in the 1970s, early 1970s. But we found some people couldn't read and did not want to say they couldn't read. So we figured out, okay, here's how we can find out whether somebody can read or not. And then we'd take them aside and we'd say, I don't think you can read, brother, but I'm not going to tell anybody. But you actually need to learn to read, because you got to be getting into this. You got to be a part of this. And then we'd actually do political education classes that were actually literacy classes. And we were doing it around revolutionary literature. So I think that's important, and we need a society, because I made some mention of the different levels, you know, the people who were, you know, playing the guard function, the supervisors, the health people, and the educational people. And what I meant by that is, if someone needs to be confined for the security of society, that doesn't mean they're just locked up and that's it. There should be the possibility of education, whether that's, you know, teaching them to read, teaching them basic skills, or advanced education. Just because you happen to be in prison doesn't mean you should not have access to that. And that would be something that I think we would have to do.
Yeah, and along with vocational training. And however, there there is, on September 9th, there is a movement to do a work stoppage in prison. So go ahead and Google that. I found out about that from Chris Hedges, who interviewed me on Russia Today. And what that means is that at least 4 states so far, I believe it's California, Alabama, New York, and one other, are planning widespread work stoppages on the 9th. And they want to draw attention to the fact that the 13th Amendment, especially the provision that continues to allow slavery in our prisons, is alive and well. And that provision needs to be taken out of the 13th Amendment. Slavery shouldn't exist in any form in this great country of ours.
Okay, I see a few hands now.
I think she was waiting. Were you waiting?
She was one, but I saw a hand in the back and one over here. So let's,
Two more questions.
okay, well, there are 3 hands.
Three.
3 more questions.
So we'll take these 3 and then we'll wrap it.
Okay, so I wanted to comment on the school to prison pipeline, and it's interesting that you said your experience.
Hold on,
being
you're not being
No.
like.
Oh,
Sorry.
No, it was on. It is.
No, to
okay,
your-
so I wanted to comment on the school to prison
That's-
pipeline. Your comment about the prisoners can't read, but if you even come here in society and you go to our high schools, the kids can't read there also. So you have that problem. This is why we have the initiative, the alternative education programs in many of the cities in the US to bring a lot of the young people who are getting in trouble in school. And yes, I used to work in the public school system, and I see a lot of the signs in the classroom, and they look at it and say, well, it's just classroom management. But no, it's not. These kids have really deep mental health issues, and they're not being dealt with. The solution that they have for it is to suspend those kids. Basically, you go out of school for 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days. You stay home, eat in bed, and do nothing, and come back home. Nobody's monitoring and see what these kids are doing. Parents don't know a lot. They see their kids acting out. They think these kids are just acting out. So we really have a really big issue in our society. And I wanted to comment on this young lady. What's your name? I'm sorry? Ata, about what are we doing as a society. If we want to really reform the prison system, we have to reform every factors of our lives. I mean, from the year these kids are going to school, I mean, every system in our lives. I mean, these prisoners were once students. They were once members of our society, and they had issues that were not dealt with in the public school system. The public school system is still a failure, and I'm not an advocate for charter school. Okay, I'm not saying replace them with the corporatized and privatized charter school. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to improve our public schools. We need to put more social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists in the public school to help these kids. And we need to stop suspending these kids and criminalizing these kids when they're in kindergarten.
And that was what the agency I worked for, that's what they were all about. They were taking the kids who had behavioral issues, but that were grounded in mental illness,
Yep.
and we were getting them treatment. The program worked, and it was defunded. That the agency I worked for no longer exists.
Yeah, that was before you worked in the prison.
Before I worked in the prison, yeah.
Okay, there was a hand in the back and then we'll wind up with
Who is
them.
Angel?
Oh, boy, okay.
Actually, I thought it was the person behind you. who had-
They're working together.
However, okay, go ahead.
Hi. Okay. I have a comment. Okay, so, for-profit prisons, they make money from having a lot of people there, so that's why the recidivism rates are higher.
Say it, girl.
So, yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a
Thank you,
business.
thank you. That's a great comment.
It's a business.
Yeah.
And the business needs prisoners. to survive.
Who is the other one?
Yeah.
I mean, I have a comment and I have a question. I just want to say, look, the very fact that you would have a system that would treat over 2 million people, that would torture people, vast majority black or brown, it's not for profit. This is an illegitimate system. This is a system that if a mother can't see her son for years, this is an illegitimate system and it needs to be gotten rid of at the soonest possible time. It is immoral, it is unjust, and nobody should live comfortably until we get rid of that system. And it's a system of capitalism, okay? And so, but that's not, it's not for profit, you know. I just want to say that because let's be clear on what's really the problem, what's really the solution. The question I want to ask you, and somebody had raised it earlier, right? Of you know, you're like a whistleblower. That's a pretty heavy thing, right? Because it's like, you know, Edward Snowden, right? He went into the NSA thinking that he could change things. So he went into the NSA right after the 9/11, I think, or around that time. And then he discovered all these things, right, of what the government was doing. I don't know, I haven't read your book, but I don't know what all the thinking was to go into this field of work, right? But you didn't just discover these things and kind of sit comfortably as that was going on. You said, I have to do something about this, and you expose this to society. One, I think that's very important, but I'm just wondering, you know, what was the process that you had to go through? That's a, you know, and you lost your job, all these things, and so it's not like it's all smooth sailing. So here we are. I mean, I'm just curious what, you know, what were you thinking? And a very good thing you did, but you know, just curious.
I knew from I guess my early 30s, you know, we talk about life purpose, and I knew I needed to do something that would make a difference. And I had applied to law school at the University of Miami, and I was accepted. And that whole summer before law school, I just had a creeped out feeling. I can't tell you, it was just an ugly feeling. And I had a psych undergrad also at the U of M. And I thought to myself, you know, if you love psychology so much, that is what you should be doing. And all of a sudden, this huge weight lifted off my shoulders. And I enrolled in a master's program and got my degree in counseling and became a counselor to make a difference. Now, in terms of me not sitting by while my patients were being abused and brutalized, I think about, hey, where did that exactly come from? And I don't know, I don't really feel like my parents instilled that within me somehow. Maybe there's a genetic marker for it, I don't know. But there was just, I always sort of rooted for the underdog. And I would look at people that were marginalized or disenfranchised, and I would feel it. I would just feel awful for these people. And because I grew up relatively privileged, I mentioned, you know, I lived in Miami Beach, and, you know, even so, I was reading the paper at a young age. I knew what was happening in Miami, and it bothered me. And so I took this into the prison environment and that system that took these people that were so downtrodden and then made their lives even worse. I couldn't sit for it. I had to do something about it. And this is the one of my pet peeves is I'm a member of an excruciatingly small minority of people who will stand up and put themselves at risk, okay? I lost my job. You know, I hope nothing worse than that comes my way, but who's to say, okay? And there are just very few people that are gonna stand up and say something, and continue to say it until it's changed or until they're silenced. And so, you know, if anybody out there is hearing this on the internet, if you see something horrible happening, don't stand by and just let it happen, okay? Because you're, you know, it sounds cliche, but if you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem.
Yep.
And I want to be a part of the solution. That's what I'm all about here, reaching out to you all here. And tonight, you guys have been such a great audience. And I can just tell, very engaged. And you're thinking about this. And Carl and I let you in on some new information here. Reach out to your friends, okay? Go look up Carl's name, Carl Dix. Find out what he's about. Look up me. I'm easy to find. Gettingaway-with-murder.org. That's easy to remember. Get involved. Reach out to your local representative, your senator, your state senator. What are you doing about mental health? What are you doing about prison reform? Okay, make these people do something instead of nothing, which is what we're seeing basically so far.
Okay, that's the end of our formal program. People want to raise some more, we can do that afterwards. I'm sure George is going to be around. His book is available up front, and I'm sure he'll sign it for you.
Okay.
If you get it.
Yeah, and if we run out of books, we're going to take advance orders, and I will sign all those books, so you can come back to RB and pick up your signed book.
Right.
All right.
Thank you.